Section 6 of the Ingoldsby Legends, First Series. This recording is in the public domain. The Ingoldsby Legends, First Series, by Richard Harris Barham. Section 6. The succeeding legend has long been an established favourite with all of us, as containing much of the personal history of one of the greatest ornaments of the family tree. To the wedding between the sole heiress of this redoubted hero and a direct ancestor it is owing that the lion cells of Shurland hang so lovingly parallel with the saltire of the Ingoldsbys, and now form as cherished a quartering in their escutcheon as the dozen white louses in the old coat of Shallow. Grey Dolphin, a legend of Sheppey. "He won't he? Then bring me my boots," said the Baron. Consternation was at its height in the castle of Shurland. A caitiff had dared to disobey the Baron, and the Baron had called for his boots. A thunderbolt in the great hall had been a bagatelle to it. A few days before, a notable miracle had been wrought in the neighbourhood, and in those times miracles were not so common as they are now. No royal balloons, no steam, no railroads, while the few saints who took the trouble to walk with their heads under their arms or to pull the devil by the nose scarcely appeared above once in a century, so the affair made the greater sensation. The clock had done striking 12, and the Clerk of Chatham was untrussing his points preparatory to seeking his truckle-bed. A half-emptied tankard of mild ale stood at his elbow. The roasted crab was floating on its surface. Midnight had surprised the worthy functionary while occupied in discussing it, and with his task yet unaccomplished. He meditated a mighty draught. One hand was fumbling with his tags, while the other was extended in the act of grasping the jorum, when a knock on the portal, solemn and sonorous, arrested his fingers. It was repeated thrice ere Emmanuel Saddleton had presence of mind sufficient to inquire who sought admittance at that untimous hour. "Open, open, good Clerk of St. Bridget's," said a female voice, small yet distinct and sweet, an excellent thing in woman. The clerk arose, crossed to the doorway, and undid the latchet. On the threshold stood a lady of surpassing beauty. Her robes were rich and large and full, and a diadem, sparkling with gems that shed a halo around, crowned her brow. She beckoned the clerk as he stood in astonishment before her. "Emmanuel," said the lady, and her tones sounded like those of a silver flute. "Emmanuel Saddleton, truss up your points and follow me." The worthy clerk stared aghast at the vision. The purple robe, the simar, the coronet, above all, the smile. No, there was no mistaking her. It was the blessed St. Bridget herself. And what could have brought the sainted lady out of her warm shrine at such a time of night, and on such a night, for it was as dark as pitch, and, metaphorically speaking, reigned cats and dogs? Emmanuel could not speak, so he looked the question. "No matter for that," said the saint, answering to his thought. "No matter for that, Emmanuel Saddleton. Only follow me, and you'll see." The clerk turned a wistful eye at the corner cupboard. "Oh, never mind the lantern, Emmanuel. You'll not want it, but you may bring a mattock and a shovel." As she spoke, the beautiful apparition held up her delicate hand. From the tip of each of her long taper fingers issued a lambent flame of such surpassing brilliancy as would have plunged a whole gas company into despair. It was a hand of glory. Footnote: one of the uses to which this mystic chandelier was put was the protection of secreted treasure. Blow out all the fingers at one puff, and you had the money. End footnote. Such a one as tradition tells us yet burns in Rochester Castle every St. Mark's Eve. Many are the daring individuals who have watched in Gundulph's Tower, hoping to find it and the treasure it guards, but none of them ever did. This way, Emmanuel," and a flame of peculiar radiance streamed from her little finger as it pointed to the pathway leading to the churchyard. Saddleton shouldered his tools and followed in silence. The cemetery of St. Bridget's was some half-mile distant from the clerk's domicile, and adjoined a chapel dedicated to that illustrious lady, who, after leading but a so-so life, had died in the odour of sanctity. Emmanuel Saddleton was fat and scant of breath. The mattock was heavy, and the saint walked too fast for him. He paused to take second wind at the end of the first furlong. "Emmanuel," said the holy lady, good-humouredly, for she heard him puffing, "rest a while, Emmanuel, and I'll tell you what I want with you." Her auditor wiped his brow with the back of his hand, and looked all attention and obedience. "Emmanuel," continued she, "what did you and Father Fothergill, and the rest of you, mean yesterday by burying that drowned man so close to me? He died in mortal sin, Emmanuel. No shrift, no unction, no absolution. Why, he might as well have been excommunicated. He plagues me with his grinning, and I can't have any peace in my shrine. You must howk him up again, Emmanuel." "To be sure, madam, my lady, that is, your holiness," stammered Saddleton, trembling at the thought of the task assigned him. "To be sure, your ladyship, only, that is—" "Emmanuel," said the saint, "you'll do my bidding, or it would be better you had." And her eye changed from a dove's eye to that of a hawk, and a flash came from it as bright as the one from her little finger. The clerk shook in his shoes, and again dashing the cold perspiration from his brow, followed the footsteps of his mysterious guide. The next morning all Chatham was in an uproar. The clerk of St. Bridget's had found himself at home at daybreak, seated in his own armchair, the fire out, and the tankard of ale out too. Who had drunk it? Where had he been? How had he got home? All was a mystery. He remembered a mass of things, but nothing distinctly. All was fog and fantasy. What he could clearly recollect was, that he had dug up the grinning sailor, and that the saint had helped to throw him into the river again. All was thenceforth wonderment and devotion. Masses were sung, tapers were kindled, bells were tolled. The monks of St. Romuald had a solemn procession, the abbot at their head, the sacristan at their tail, and the holy breeches of St. Thomas a Becket in the centre. Father Fothergill brewed a triple X puncheon of holy water. The rood of Gillingham was deserted, the chapel of Rainham forsaken. Every one who had a soul to be saved flocked with his offering to St. Bridget's shrine, and Emmanuel Saddleton gathered more fees from the promiscuous piety of that 1 week than he had pocketed during the 12 preceding months. Meanwhile the corpse of the ejected reprobate oscillated like a pendulum between Sheerness and Gillingham Reach, now borne by the Medway into the western swale, now carried by the refluent tide back to the vicinity of its old quarters. It seemed as though the river god and Neptune were amusing themselves with a game of subaqueous battledore, and had chosen this unfortunate carcass as a marine shuttlecock. For some time the alternation was kept up with great spirit, till Boreas, interfering in the shape of a stiffish nor'wester, drifted the bone and flesh of contention ashore on the Shurland domain, where it lay in all the majesty of mud. It was soon discovered by the retainers and dragged from its oozy bed, grinning worse than ever. Tidings of the godsend were, of course, carried instantly to the castle, for the Baron was a very great man, and if a dun cow had flown across his property unannounced by the warder, the Baron would have kicked him, the said warder, from the topmost battlement into the bottommost ditch, a descent of peril, and one which Ludwig the Leaper, or the illustrious Trenck himself, might well have shrunk from encountering. " An't please your lordship," said Peter Periwinkle. " No, villain, it does not please me," roared the Baron. His lordship was deeply engaged with a peck of Faversham oysters. He doted on shellfish, hated interruption at meals, and had not yet dispatched more than 20 dozen of the natives. " Here's a body, my lord, washed ashore in the lower creek," said the seneschal. The Baron was going to throw the shells at his head, but paused in the act, and said with much dignity, " Turn out the fellow's pockets." But the defunct had before been subjected to the double scrutiny of Father Fothergill and the clerk of St. Bridget's. It was ill gleaning after such hands. There was not a single maravedi. We have already said that Sir Robert de Shurland, Lord of the Isle of Sheppey, and of many a fair manor on the mainland, was a man of worship. He had rights of free warren, saccage and soccage, cuisage and jambage, foss and fork, in-fang thief and out-fang thief, and all waifs and strays belonged to him in fee simple. " Turn out his pockets," said the knight, " and please you, my lord, I must say as how they was turned out afore, and the devil a raps left. Then bury the blackguard. Please your lordship, he has been buried once. Then bury him again, and be—" The Baron bestowed a benediction. The seneschal bowed low as he left the room, and the Baron went on with his oysters. Scarcely 10 dozen more had vanished when Periwinkle reappeared. " And please you, my lord, Father Fothergill says as how that it's the grinning sailor, and he won't bury him anyhow." " Oh, he won't he? " said the Baron. " Can it be wondered at that he called for his boots? Sir Robert de Shurland, Lord of Shurland, and Minster, Baron of Sheppey, in Comitatu Kent, was, as has been before hinted, a very great man. He was also a very little man. That is, he was relatively great and relatively little, or physically little and metaphorically great, like Sir Sidney Smith and the late Mr. Bonaparte. To the frame of a dwarf he united the soul of a giant and the valour of a gamecock. Then, for so small a man, his strength was prodigious. His fist would fell an ox, and his kick, oh, his kick was tremendous, and when he had his boots on, would, to use an expression of his own, which he had picked up in the Holy Wars, would send a man from Jericho to June. He was bull-necked and bandy-legged. His chest was broad and deep, his head large and uncommonly thick, his eyes a little bloodshot, and his nose retroussé with a remarkably red tip. Strictly speaking, the Baron could not be called handsome, but his tout ensemble was singularly impressive, and when he called for his boots, everybody trembled and dreaded the worst. " Periwinkle," said the Baron, as he encased his better leg, " let the grave be 20 feet deep. Your lordship's command is law. And, Periwinkle," Sir Robert stamped his left heel into its receptacle, "and, Periwinkle, see that it be wide enough to hold not exceeding 2. Yes, my lord." "And, Periwinkle, tell Father Fothergill I would fain speak with his reverence." Yes, my lord." The Baron's beard was peaked, and his moustaches, stiff and stumpy, projected horizontally like those of a tomcat. He twirled the one, he stroked the other, he drew the buckle of his surcingle a thought tighter, and strode down the great staircase 3 steps at a stride. The vassals were assembled in the great hall of Shurland Castle. Every cheek was pale, every tongue was mute. Expectation and perplexity were visible on every brow. What would his lordship do? Were the recusant anybody else, gyves to the heels and hemp to the throat were but too good for him. But it was Father Fothergill who had said, "I won't," and though the Baron was a very great man, the Pope was a greater, and the Pope was Father Fothergill's great friend. Some people said he was his uncle. Father Fothergill was busy in the refectory trying conclusions with a venison pasty, when he received the summons of his patron to attend him in the chapel cemetery. Of course he lost no time in obeying it, for obedience was the general rule in Shurland Castle. If anybody ever said, "I won't," it was the exception, and, like all other exceptions, only proved the rule the stronger. The father was a friar of the Augustan persuasion, a brotherhood which, having been planted in Kent some few centuries earlier, had taken very kindly to the soil, and overspread the county much as hops did some few centuries later. He was plump and portly, a little thick-winded, especially after dinner, stood 5 feet 4 in his sandals, and weighed hard upon 18 stone. He was, moreover, a personage of singular piety, and the iron girdle, which, he said, he wore under his cassock to mortify withal, might have been well mistaken for the tire of a cart-wheel. When he arrived, Sir Robert was pacing up and down by the side of a newly opened grave. "Benedicite, fair son." The Baron was brown as a cigar. "Benedicite," said the chaplain. The Baron was too angry to stand upon compliment. "Bury me that grinning caitiff there," quoth he, pointing to the defunct. "It may not be, fair son," said the friar. "He hath perished without absolution." "Bury the body," roared Sir Robert. "Water and earth alike reject him," returned the chaplain. "Holy Saint Bridget herself, Bridget me no Bridgets. Do me thine office quickly, Sir Shaveling, or by the piper that played before Moses." The oath was a fearful one, and whenever the Baron swore to do mischief, he was never known to perjure himself. He was playing with the hilt of his sword. "Do me thine office, I say. Give him his passport to heaven." "He is already gone to hell," stammered the friar. "Then do you go after him," thundered the Lord of Shurland. His sword half leaped from its scabbard. No, the trenchant blade that had cut Suleiman ben Malek ben Buckskin from helmet to chine disdained to daub itself with the cerebellum of a miserable monk. It leaped back again, and as the chaplain, scared at its flash, turned him in terror, the Baron gave him a kick. One kick. It was but one, but such a one! Despite its obesity, up flew his holy body at an angle of 45 degrees, then, having reached its highest point of elevation, sunk headlong into the open grave that yawned to receive it. If the reverend gentleman had possessed such a thing as a neck, he had infallibly broken it. As he did not, he only dislocated his vertebrae, but that did quite as well. He was as dead as ditch water. "In with the other rascal," said the Baron, and he was obeyed, for there he stood in his boots. Mattock and shovel made short work of it. 20 feet of superincumbent mould pressed down alike the saint and the sinner. "Now sing a requiem who list," said the Baron, and his lordship went back to his oysters. The vassals at Castle Shurland were astounded, or, as the Seneschal Hugh better expressed it, perfectly conglomerated by this event. What, murder a monk in the odour of sanctity, and on consecrated ground, too? They trembled for the health of the Baron's soul. To the unsophisticated many, it seemed that matters could not have been much worse had he shot a bishop's coach-horse. All looked for some signal judgment. The melancholy catastrophe of their neighbours at Canterbury was yet rife in their memories. Not 2 centuries had elapsed since those miserable sinners had cut off the tail of the blessed St. Thomas' mule. The tail of the mule, it was well known, had been forthwith affixed to that of the mare, and rumour said it had since been hereditary in the corporation. The least that could be expected was, that Sir Robert should have a friar tacked on to his, for the term of his natural life. Some bolder spirits there were, 'tis true, who viewed the matter in various lights, according to their different temperaments and dispositions, for perfect unanimity existed not even in the good old times. The verderer, roystering Hob Roebuck, swore roundly, 'twere as good a deed as eat, to kick down the chapel as well as a monk. Hob had stood there in a white sheet for kissing Giles Miller's daughter. On the other hand, Simpkin Agnew, the bell-ringer, doubted if the Devil's Cellar, which runs under the bottomless abyss, were quite deep enough for the delinquent, and speculated on the probability of a hole being dug in it for his especial accommodation. The philosophers and economists thought, with Saunders MacBulloch, the Baron's bagpiper, that a feckless monk, more or less, was nae great subject for a clam-jamfrey, especially as the supply considerably exceeded the demand, while Malthouse, the tapster, was arguing to Dame Martin that a murder now and then was a seasonable check to population, without which the Isle of Sheppey would in time be devoured like a mouldy cheese, by inhabitants of its own producing. Meanwhile the Baron ate his oysters and thought no more of the matter. But this tranquillity of his lordship was not to last. A couple of saints had been seriously offended, and we have all of us read at school that celestial minds are by no means insensible to the provocations of anger. There were those who expected that St. Bridget would come in person and have the friar up again, as she did the sailor, but perhaps her ladyship did not care to trust herself within the walls of Shurland Castle. To say the truth, it was scarcely a decent house for a female saint to be seen in. The Baron's gallantries, since he became a widower, had been but too notorious, and her own reputation was a little blown upon in the earlier days of her earthly pilgrimage. Then things were so apt to be misrepresented. In short, she would leave the whole affair to St. Austin, who, being a gentleman, could interfere with propriety, avenge her affront as well as his own, and leave no loophole for scandal. St. Austin himself seems to have had his scruples, though of their precise nature it would be difficult to determine, for it were idle to suppose him at all afraid of the Baron's boots. Be this as it may, the mode which he adopted was at once prudent and efficacious. As an ecclesiastic, he could not well call the Baron out, had his boots been out of the question, so he resolved to have recourse to the law. Instead of Shurland Castle, therefore, he repaired forthwith to his own magnificent monastery, situate just without the walls of Canterbury, and presented himself in a vision to its abbot. No one who has ever visited that ancient city can fail to recollect the splendid gateway which terminates the vista of St. Paul's Street, and stands there yet in all its pristine beauty. The tiny train of miniature artillery which now adorns its battlements is, it is true, an ornament of a later date, and is said to have been added some centuries after, by a learned but jealous proprietor, for the purpose of shooting any wiser man than himself who might chance to come that way. Tradition is silent as to any discharge having taken place, nor can the oldest inhabitant of modern days recollect any such occurrence. Footnote: since the appearance of the first edition of this legend, the guns have been dismounted. Rumor hints at some alarm on the part of the town council. End footnote. Here it was, in a handsome chamber immediately over the lofty archway, that the superior of the monastery lay buried in a brief slumber snatched from his accustomed vigils. His mitre, for he was a mitred abbot, and had a seat in Parliament, rested on a table beside him. Near it stood a silver flagon of Gascony wine, ready, no doubt, for the pious uses of the morrow. Fasting and watching had made him more than usually somnolent, than which nothing could have been better for the purpose of the saint, who now appeared to him radiant in all the colours of the rainbow. "Anselm," said the beatific vision, "Anselm, are you not a pretty fellow to lie snoring there when your brethren are being knocked at head, and Mother Church herself is menaced? It is a sin and a shame, Anselm. What's the matter? Who are you?" cried the abbot, rubbing his eyes, which the celestial splendour of his visitor had set a-winking. "Ave Maria! St. Austin himself! Speak, Beatissime, what would you with the humblest of your votaries?" "Anselm," said the saint, "a brother of our order, whose soul heaven assoilzie, hath been foully murdered. He hath been ignominiously kicked to the death, Anselm, and there he lieth cheek by jowl with a wretched carcass, which our sister Bridget has turned out of her cemetery for unseemly grinning. Arouse thee, Anselm." "Ay, so please you, Sanctissime," said the abbot, "I will order forthwith that 30 masses be said, 30 paters, and 30 aves." "30 fools' heads," interrupted his patron, who was a little peppery. "I will send for bell, book, and candle." "Send for an inkhorn, Anselm. Write me now a letter to his Holiness the Pope in good round terms, and another to the coroner, and another to the sheriff, and seize me the never enough to be anathematized villain who hath done this deed. Hang him as high as Haman, Anselm. Up with him, down with his dwelling place, root and branch, hearthstone and roof tree, down with it all, and sow the site with salt and sawdust." St. Austin, it will be perceived, was a radical reformer. "Marry, will I," quoth the abbot, warming with the saint's eloquence. "Ay, marry, will I, and that instanter. But there is one thing you have forgotten, most beatified, the name of the culprit." "Robert de Shurland." "The Lord of Sheppey? Bless me," said the abbot, crossing himself, "won't that be rather inconvenient? Sir Robert is a bold baron, and a powerful. Blows will come and go, and crowns will be cracked, and— what is that to you, since yours will not be of the number?" "Very true, Beatissime. I will don me with speed, and do your bidding." "Do so, Anselm. Fail not to hang the Baron, burn his castle, confiscate his estate, and buy me 2 large wax candles for my own particular shrine out of your share of the property." With this solemn injunction the vision began to fade. "One more thing," cried the abbot, grasping his rosary. "What is that?" asked the saint. "O Beate Augustina, ora pro nobis." "Of course I shall," said St. Austin. "Pax vobiscum." And Abbot Anselm was left alone. End of Section 6.